Victoria Chen had been awake for nearly 20 hours straight. Her eyes felt heavy, her back ached from sitting in conference rooms, and all she wanted was to get home. Well, not exactly home. She was heading to Singapore for another business meeting, but at least she'd have a few hours on the plane to rest. She'd earned it after the marathon negotiation session she'd just survived in New York. At 42 years old, Victoria had built her technology company from nothing. She started in a tiny apartment with just her laptop and an idea. Now Global Tech Solutions employed over 15,000 people across 12 countries. People called her tough. Some called her demanding, but anyone who really knew her understood she was fair. She treated everyone with respect, from the janitor to the board members. That's just who she was. The airport terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of international travel. Families saying goodbye. Business travelers rushing past with rolling suitcases, announcement voices echoing through the corridors. Victoria moved through it all with practiced ease. She'd been on hundreds of flights. This was just another Thursday. She handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, who smiled professionally and wished her a pleasant flight. First class, seat 2A. Victoria had earned every mile that got her those upgrades. Years of constant travel, living out of suitcases, missing birthdays and holidays. But she never complained. This was the life she'd chosen, and she was grateful for every opportunity. Walking down the jet bridge, Victoria rolled her shoulders, trying to release some of the tension. The deal she'd just closed was massive. $500 million. It would allow her company to expand into 3 new markets and create jobs for another 2,000 people. Her team had worked so hard for this. She couldn't wait to tell them the good news. The flight attendant stood at the aircraft door, greeting passengers as they boarded. She had blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun and wore the airline's crisp uniform. Her name tag read Linda. As Victoria approached, she smiled warmly at the passenger ahead of her, an older gentleman in an expensive suit. "Welcome aboard, sir. Let me help you with that bag." Victoria stepped forward next, offering a polite smile. "Good evening." Linda's smile vanished. She looked Victoria up and down with barely concealed irritation, then waved her past without a word. No greeting. No welcome, nothing. Victoria paused for just a second, surprised by the coldness. But she shrugged it off. Maybe Linda was having a bad day. Everyone has those. Victoria certainly understood what it felt like to be exhausted and not want to deal with people. She found her seat and settled in, tucking her bag under the seat in front of her. The first-class cabin was beautiful as always. Wide leather seats, plenty of legroom, soft lighting. She'd definitely sleep well on this flight. Or at least she hoped she would. Other passengers filed in behind her. Victoria pulled out her phone to send a quick message to her assistant, letting him know she'd boarded. Through the gap between seats, she could see Linda in the galley area, chatting with another flight attendant. A young man with dark hair and a friendly face. They seemed to be laughing about something. "Champagne, sir?" Linda's voice floated through the cabin, sweet and attentive. Victoria glanced up. Linda was serving the older gentleman who'd boarded just before her. She poured the golden liquid with a flourish, making small talk about the weather and the flight time. The man seemed delighted by the attention. Linda moved to the next passenger, a woman in a designer dress who looked like she was heading to a fashion show. Same warm smile, same attentive service. "Would you care for champagne or perhaps some sparkling water?" Victoria waited. Surely she'd be next. But Linda walked right past her row without even a glance. She continued down the aisle, serving every single first-class passenger. Every single one except Victoria. At first, Victoria thought maybe Linda just hadn't seen her. It was possible. The cabin was filling up. People were still settling in. Overhead bins were slamming shut. Maybe Linda would circle back, but 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Linda returned to the galley, chatting casually with the male flight attendant. They were discussing their schedules, complaining about early morning flights, laughing about something one of their co-workers had done. Normal workplace conversation. Neither of them looked in Victoria's direction. Victoria felt a small knot forming in her stomach. Something felt off. She'd flown first class hundreds of times. The service was usually impeccable. Flight attendants fell over themselves to make passengers comfortable. That was literally their job, especially in the premium cabin. She looked around at the other passengers. Everyone had drinks. Everyone had been offered warm nuts or canapes. Everyone except her. Maybe she was being paranoid. Maybe she was just tired and reading too much into things. Victoria pulled out her tablet, deciding to review some documents for her Singapore meeting. Work was always a good distraction. The plane pushed back from the gate, and the safety announcement began playing on the overhead screens. Victoria had heard it so many times she could recite it by heart. She closed her eyes, trying to relax. Just a few more minutes until takeoff, then she could recline her seat and try to sleep. The engines roared to life. The plane taxied toward the runway, stopping once to let another aircraft pass. Then they were moving again, faster this time, the force pressing Victoria back into her seat. The nose lifted and they were airborne. New York disappeared below them, a carpet of light stretching to the horizon. Victoria loved this part. That moment when you leave the ground and everything feels possible, like you're leaving your problems behind, at least for a little while. Once they reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinged off. Linda and the male flight attendant, whose name tag said Troy, emerged from their jump seats and began preparing the meal service. Victoria could smell it now. Something delicious. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since that morning. A stale bagel grabbed between meetings. She was starving. Linda appeared with a tray for the gentleman in front of Victoria. Grilled salmon with roasted vegetables, a fresh salad, warm bread. It looked incredible. The man thanked her profusely and Linda beamed. "Absolutely, my pleasure, sir. Please let me know if you need anything at all." Next came the fashion show woman. Chicken and some kind of cream sauce, equally impressive. Linda chatted with her about the meal, explaining each component like a restaurant server. Victoria sat up straighter, ready to order. She was so hungry her hands were starting to shake slightly. Low blood sugar combined with exhaustion wasn't a good combination, but once again Linda walked right past her. Not just past her. She made a point of turning her body away, angling herself so she wouldn't have to make eye contact. Now Victoria knew for certain. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't an oversight. This was deliberate. She watched as Linda served every other passenger in first class. All 12 of them. Some got the salmon. Some got the chicken. One vegetarian passenger received a special pasta dish. Everyone was eating. Everyone except Victoria. The smell of the food was torture now. Victoria's stomach growled loudly enough that the passenger across the aisle glanced over. She felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. What was happening? Why was she being ignored? Had she done something wrong? She replayed boarding in her mind, trying to think if she'd been rude somehow. But no, she'd barely said 2 words. Just a polite greeting that Linda had completely blown off. Victoria reached up and pressed the call button. A soft chime sounded. She waited and waited. 5 minutes passed. The call light stayed on, blinking steadily above her seat. Linda and Troy moved around the cabin, clearing trays, offering coffee and tea, asking if anyone needed anything. They both looked directly at Victoria's call light multiple times. They both ignored it. Victoria felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest. Anger, yes, but also something else, humiliation. She was being treated like she didn't exist. Like she didn't matter. And it was happening in front of a cabin full of strangers who were starting to notice. The woman across the aisle leaned over slightly. "Excuse me, I think your call light has been on for a while." "I'm sure they just didn't notice." Victoria managed a tight smile. "I'm sure you're right," but she wasn't sure at all. Because deep in her gut, Victoria knew this was something more than bad service. This was the beginning of something much worse. Victoria pressed the call button again, then again. At this point, she didn't even care about being polite anymore. The light above her head blinked insistently, impossible to miss. Yet somehow Linda and Troy continued to miss it. She watched Troy walk past her row for the 3rd time, carrying a coffee pot. He glanced up at her call light, then deliberately looked away and kept walking. It wasn't even subtle anymore. They were actively avoiding her. The passenger across the aisle, a kind-looking woman in her 60s, caught Victoria's eye and shook her head in disbelief. "This is ridiculous," she mouthed silently. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, Linda appeared at Victoria's row. But there was no apology on her face. No embarrassment about the delay. Instead, she wore an expression of pure annoyance, like Victoria was bothering her by simply existing. "What now?" Linda's voice dripped with irritation. Victoria took a deep breath, keeping her voice calm and professional. "I'd like to order my meal, please." "I haven't been served yet." Linda's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. Haven't been served? I'm sure I came by earlier. No, you didn't. Victoria kept her tone even. You served everyone else in the cabin, but you skipped my row. Well, I'm very busy. Linda crossed her arms. There are a lot of passengers on this flight. I understand that. I'd just like to order my meal now, please. Linda sighed dramatically, as if Victoria had just asked her to perform some impossible task. Fine, what do you want? What are the options? We have salmon or chicken. I'll take the salmon, please. Linda's lips curved into a small, unpleasant smile. Actually, we're all out of salmon. Victoria glanced toward the galley where she could clearly see at least 2 more salmon meals wrapped and ready. I can see the salmon meals from here. Those are reserved. Reserved for whom? I'm in first class. I have every right to order from the first class menu. Look, I don't make the rules. Linda's voice rose slightly. We're out of salmon for you. You can have chicken or nothing. Several passengers were watching now, not even trying to hide their interest. This was turning into a scene, and Victoria hated scenes. But she also wasn't going to be bullied. Fine, I'll have the chicken then. Linda rolled her eyes so obviously that even passengers several rows back could see it. I'll check if we have any left. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Victoria noticed her whisper something to Troy, and they both laughed. Actually laughed. Right there in front of everyone. The woman across the aisle leaned over again. I've never seen anything like this. This is completely unacceptable. You should report her. Victoria managed a weak smile. I might just do that. But even as she said it, part of her wondered if it would make any difference. She'd filed complaints before, about various things over the years. Sometimes companies responded. Often they didn't. A strongly worded apology letter and some bonus miles seemed to be the standard response to everything. 15 more minutes crawled by. Victoria watched other passengers finish their meals, receive dessert, get coffee refills. The businessman in front of her was on his second glass of wine. The fashion show woman had ordered tea and was now enjoying a chocolate mousse that looked absolutely divine. Victoria's hunger had moved beyond uncomfortable into actual pain. Her head was starting to pound. She needed food and she needed it soon. Finally, Linda returned. She carried a tray, but she didn't hand it to Victoria with the same care she'd shown other passengers. Instead, she practically dropped it onto the seatback tray, making the contents rattle. Victoria looked down at her meal. The chicken was dried out, overcooked to the point where it looked like leather. The vegetables were brown and wilted. The bread roll was hard enough to use as a weapon. This wasn't just bad airline food. This was something that should have been thrown away. Is this the chicken dinner? Victoria asked carefully. That's what you ordered. Linda's smile was sharp. Enjoy. She walked away before Victoria could respond. Victoria stared at the meal, her appetite completely gone now. Even if she'd been starving to death, she wasn't sure she could eat this. It looked like it had been sitting out for hours. The older woman across the aisle made a sympathetic face. Would you like half of my dessert? I ordered extra. The kindness in her voice nearly broke Victoria's composure. She felt tears prick at her eyes, which made her angry at herself. She was the CEO of a major corporation. She'd negotiated with ruthless businessmen, dealt with hostile board members, survived a dozen attempts to force her out of her own company. And here she was, nearly crying over bad airplane food and a rude flight attendant. That's very kind of you, but I'm okay. Thank you, though. Victoria pushed the tray aside and pulled out her phone instead. She opened her notes app and began typing. Date, time, flight number, Linda's name, Troy's name, a detailed description of everything that had happened so far. As she typed, she noticed something. Linda kept looking in her direction, and whenever she saw Victoria on her phone, her expression darkened. There was something almost nervous in her eyes now. Good. She should be nervous. Victoria switched her phone to voice memo mode and slipped it into the seat pocket in front of her. Positioned, so the microphone faced outward. She wasn't sure if she'd catch anything useful, but it couldn't hurt to try. 2 hours into the flight, Victoria needed to use the bathroom. She stood and made her way toward the back of the first-class cabin, where the lavatories were located. As she approached, she heard voices coming from the galley area. Linda and Troy talking in low tones. Victoria slowed her steps, staying just out of sight. I still can't believe Derek actually flagged her profile. That was Troy's voice. That's so petty, even for him. She deserves it. Linda's voice was cold. Did you hear what she did to his nephew? Refused to even give him an interview. Just threw his application in the trash. Come on, you don't know that. Derek told me the whole story. The kid was perfect for the position. Top grades, great recommendations. But she took one look at his name and decided he wasn't diverse enough for her woke company. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. Derek? She didn't know any Derek, and what nephew? Troy laughed uncomfortably. Oh, that seems like a stretch. You don't know how these people operate. Linda's voice was full of venom now. They only care about diversity quotas and political correctness. Qualified people don't matter anymore. Derek's nephew worked his whole life for a chance like that, and she crushed him without a second thought. So we're supposed to what? Starve her in flight? Make her miserable? Derek just asked us to give her the service she deserves. Nothing more, nothing less. If that happens to be terrible service, well, that's just karma. Troy was quiet for a moment. I don't know, Linda, this feels wrong. We could lose our jobs. Derek's an operations manager. He has pull. He'll protect us. Besides, who's she going to complain to? Everyone knows frequent complainers get blacklisted. She makes a fuss and she'll find herself flying economy for the rest of her life. Victoria's hands were shaking now, but not from low blood sugar anymore. This was deliberate, planned. Some operations manager named Derek had flagged her profile, marked her as a target, and these flight attendants were following his instructions. But why? She genuinely didn't remember rejecting anyone's nephew. Global Tech received thousands of applications every month. She didn't personally review them all. That would be impossible. Her HR department handled that unless. Victoria's mind raced back through the past year. There had been that one incident. A young man who'd applied for a senior developer position, despite having barely a year of experience. His resume had been padded with exaggerations and outright lies. When HR rejected him, his uncle had called the office repeatedly, demanding to speak with Victoria personally. He'd accused the company of discrimination, threatened lawsuits, left angry voicemails. Could that be Derek? Was this all because his underqualified nephew didn't get a job he wasn't ready for? Victoria quietly backed away from the galley and made her way to the bathroom. She locked the door and stared at herself in the small mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes tired. But beneath the exhaustion, she saw something else. Determination. This wasn't just about bad service anymore. This was about abuse of power. This was about someone using their position within an airline to punish passengers who'd allegedly wronged them in their personal life. How many other people had Derek flagged? How many other passengers had been treated like this? When Victoria returned to her seat, she found that her belongings had been disturbed. Her tablet was moved, her bag slightly open. Had someone gone through her things while she was gone? The violation made her skin crawl. Linda appeared moments later with a trash bag, collecting garbage from passengers. When she reached Victoria's row, she saw the untouched meal. Something wrong with your food? Her voice was saccharine sweet, but her eyes were mocking. It was inedible. Victoria met her gaze steadily. That's a shame. Well, we don't have any other meals available. I guess you should have flown private if you wanted to be picky about your food. The comment hung in the air between them. Several nearby passengers gasped audibly. Even Troy looked uncomfortable. Victoria didn't respond. She simply pulled out her phone again and made a note of the exact time and the exact words Linda had used. She noticed Linda's face go pale when she saw what Victoria was doing. Company policy prohibits recording crew members without consent, Linda said quickly. I'm not recording. I'm taking notes. Victoria's voice was calm. That's not against any policy, is it? Linda opened her mouth, then closed it again. She grabbed Victoria's tray roughly and stalked away. The rest of the flight was an exercise in endurance. Victoria was denied water refills. When she asked for a blanket, she was told they were all being used. When she tried to recline her seat, she found it was broken, though it had worked fine earlier. Small, petty inconveniences that added up to hours of discomfort. But Victoria documented everything. Every slight. Every delay. Every hostile look. Her phone was full of time-stamped notes. Her voice memo had captured the entire galley conversation. As the plane began its descent into Singapore, Victoria looked out the window at the city lights, BB, ELO. She thought about her company, about the 15,000 people who depended on her. She thought about her reputation, built over 20 years of hard work, and she thought about Derek, whoever he was. and the flight crew who decided she deserved punishment for doing her job. They had no idea who they'd messed with. None at all. The plane touched down in Singapore just after dawn. Victoria hadn't slept at all during the 14-hour flight. How could she? Between the hunger, the discomfort, and the anger coursing through her veins, sleep had been impossible. But her mind was sharp. Sharper than it had been in years, actually. Nothing focused the mind quite like injustice. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, passengers began gathering their belongings and shuffling toward the exits. Victoria remained seated watching. Linda and Troy stood by the aircraft door, smiling and thanking people for flying with them. The same warm, professional demeanor they'd shown everyone except her. When Victoria finally stood and made her way to the exit, Linda's smile vanished. "Have a nice day," she said flatly, the words devoid of any genuine feeling. Victoria paused at the door and looked Linda directly in the eyes. "I certainly will." "Will you?" Something in Victoria's tone made Linda's confident expression flicker, just for a second. Then it was back. That smug certainty that she'd gotten away with something. Victoria walked off the plane and into the jet bridge. The older woman from across the aisle caught up with her. "Excuse me, dear. I just wanted you to know that what happened on that flight was completely unacceptable. I've been flying for 40 years, and I've never seen crew members treat someone so poorly. Thank you for saying that." I wrote down my contact information. The woman pressed a business card into Victoria's hand. "If you need a witness for any complaint you file, please don't hesitate to call me. What they did was wrong, and someone needs to hold them accountable." Victoria felt a surge of gratitude. "That's incredibly kind of you. We have to look out for each other." The woman patted her arm gently. "Good luck, dear." They parted ways at the immigration hall. Victoria made her way through customs and passport control on autopilot, her mind already working through her next steps. She needed to be strategic about this. Emotional reactions got nowhere in business. Facts, evidence, and calculated moves were what produced results. By the time she reached her hotel room, Victoria had a plan. She ordered room service, finally getting the meal she'd been denied for the past 14 hours. While she ate, she transferred all her notes and voice recordings to her laptop. She organized everything chronologically, adding context and details while they were fresh in her memory. Then she opened her laptop and began researching. First, she needed to find out who Derek was. She started with the airline's LinkedIn page, searching through their operations staff. There were 3 people named Derek in operations roles. She pulled up each profile looking for connections to anyone who might have applied to Global Tech. The third Derek made her pause. Derek Patterson, operations manager for the New York hub. She clicked through to his connections and found it. A young man named Bradley Patterson, who listed Derek as his uncle on Facebook. And there, in Bradley's work history, was an application to Global Tech dated 10 months ago. Victoria logged into her company's HR system and searched for Bradley's application. It took a few minutes, but she found it. He'd applied for a senior software developer position. His resume claimed 5 years of experience, expertise in 6 programming languages, and leadership roles on major projects. But when HR had done their standard verification checks, everything had fallen apart. Bradley had less than 18 months of actual work experience. His previous employer confirmed he'd been a junior developer who mostly fixed minor bugs. The major projects he'd claimed to lead, he'd been a small contributor at best. His technical test scores were in the bottom 20th percentile. The rejection had been straightforward. Not qualified for the position, he was welcome to apply for junior roles in the future. Standard procedure, nothing personal, nothing discriminatory. Just a basic requirement that applicants be honest about their qualifications. But apparently Derek hadn't seen it that way. Victoria kept digging. She requested access logs from the airline's passenger database, something she could do because Global Tech had a corporate account with the airline. The logs showed her frequent flyer profile had been accessed by Derek's credentials 4 times in the past 6 months. Each time there were notes added to her file. Difficult passenger. Special handling required. Special handling. That's what they called it. A code that told crew members to make her flight miserable. Victoria sat back in her chair, her meal forgotten. This wasn't just about her. Derek had access to millions of passenger profiles. How many other people had he flagged? How many other passengers had been targeted because they'd somehow crossed him in his personal life? She pulled up the airline's organizational chart. Derek reported to the regional operations director, who reported to the vice president of operations, who reported to the chief operating officer, who reported to the CEO, James Morrison. Victoria smiled for the first time since boarding that flight. She and James had been in business school together 15 years ago. They'd been study partners, friends even. They'd lost touch after graduation as people do, but she remembered him as someone with integrity, someone who'd be horrified by what his employee was doing. It was 3 in the morning in New York, but Victoria couldn't wait. She composed an email, attaching all her evidence. The voice recording, the notes, the access logs, Bradley's fraudulent application, everything. She wrote, "James, I hope this email finds you well. It's been too long. I'm reaching out because I've uncovered something troubling within your airline's operations that I believe you'd want to know about immediately. One of your operations managers has been abusing passenger database systems to conduct personal vendettas. I'm attaching comprehensive documentation. We should talk soon. Victoria." She hit send and sat back. Now she waited, but Victoria Chen hadn't built a successful company by sitting around waiting for other people to act. She had other calls to make, other pieces to put in place. She called her head of legal, Roger, who was just finishing his workday in New York. "Roger, I need you to look into something for me. Airline liability for deliberate discrimination and denial of services. Specifically, what happens when an airline employee uses company systems to target passengers for personal reasons?" Roger was quiet for a moment. "That's oddly specific. What happened?" Victoria explained everything. Roger listened without interrupting, which was one of the reasons she valued him. "He never jumped to conclusions. This is serious," he finally said. "If we can prove systematic abuse of their passenger database, that's potentially a massive liability issue. Not just for discrimination claims, but for data protection violations. How many other passengers did this Derek person flag? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. We'll need to file a formal complaint. Build a proper case. This could take months, I know. But Roger, think bigger. This isn't just about what happened to me. If Derek's been doing this systematically, there could be hundreds of victims. Maybe thousands. People who had terrible flight experiences and never knew why. People who thought they were just unlucky or paranoid." Roger was quiet again. Victoria could practically hear the wheels turning in his head. "You're thinking class action. I'm thinking about making sure this never happens to anyone else. Whatever form that takes. Let me do some research. I'll have a preliminary report for you by tomorrow." They hung up and Victoria opened her contacts list again. She scrolled through until she found another name. Patricia Wong, a journalist she'd worked with on a story about women in tech a few years back. Patricia worked for a major business publication and had a reputation for thorough, fair reporting. It was evening in New York, so Patricia answered on the second ring. "Victoria Chen, to what do I owe the pleasure? I might have a story for you about systematic discrimination and abuse of power within a major airline. Interested? Always. Tell me more." Victoria laid out the situation, emphasizing that she wanted this to be about the broader issue, not just her personal experience. Patricia asked sharp questions, pushing for details, confirming facts. This was why Victoria respected her. She never took anything at face value. "This is good," Patricia finally said. "Really good. But I need independent verification. Other victims. Documentation beyond just your experience. I understand. I'm working on getting that information. But Patricia, I need you to hold off on publishing anything until I've had a chance to address this directly with the airline. I want to give them the opportunity to make it right before this becomes a public scandal." "That's very gracious of you." "It's not about grace. It's about effectiveness. If I go public first, they'll just circle the wagons and deny everything. But if I give them the evidence privately, show them exactly how bad this is, they might actually fix the problem instead of just doing damage control." Patricia laughed. "You're as strategic as ever. Okay, I'll hold the story, but keep me updated. If they try to sweep this under the rug, I want to know immediately." "Deal." Victoria spent the rest of the day compiling her evidence into a comprehensive report. She included everything: screenshots of the access logs, transcripts of the voice recordings, Testimony from the older woman who'd offered to be a witness. Analysis of the pattern of entries in her passenger profile. By evening, she had a document that was 40 pages long. It was detailed, factual, and damning. She saved it, backed it up to 3 different cloud services, and sent copies to Roger and 2 other trusted advisors. Her phone rang just after midnight. A New York number she didn't recognize. She answered cautiously. "Hello? Victoria, it's James Morrison. I just read your email." His voice was strained. She could picture him in his home office, probably pacing, probably horrified. "James, thank you for calling so quickly." "Thank you?" "Victoria, I'm mortified. What Derek did, what those flight attendants did, it's inexcusable. It's a violation of everything our company stands for. I've been on the phone for the past 2 hours with our head of security, our legal team, and our HR director. We're launching a full investigation immediately. I'm glad to hear that, but I need to know, what do you want out of this? A settlement? Compensation? Free flights for life?" He laughed bitterly. "Though I imagine you never want to fly with us again." Victoria had been thinking about this question all day. What did she want? Money? She had plenty of money. An apology? Words were cheap. Revenge? She'd never been motivated by revenge. "I want you to fix the system," she said simply. "I want safeguards put in place so no employee can ever abuse passenger data like this again. I want mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff. I want an independent audit of every passenger profile Derek had access to, with personal apologies sent to anyone else who was targeted. And I want Derek and everyone who participated in this scheme fired." James was quiet for a long moment. "That's it? You're not going to sue us?" "Not if you do all of those things. Not if you make real, meaningful changes. James, I don't want to destroy your airline, but I won't let this slide either. Too many companies talk about their values without backing them up with action. This is your chance to be different. You have my word. We'll do all of it. Every single thing you asked for. Good. Because if you don't, I have a journalist standing by with all the evidence. And trust me, the story she'll write will cost you a lot more than fixing the problem." James laughed, but there was respect in it. "Still as fierce as you were in business school." "I'm sorry this happened to you, Victoria. Truly. Make it right, James, that's all I ask." After they hung up, Victoria finally let herself relax. She ordered another room service meal, took a long hot shower, and collapsed into bed. Tomorrow she had business meetings to attend. But tonight she'd done something important. She'd stood up not just for herself but for everyone else who'd ever been powerless against a broken system. And she'd done it the right way. With evidence, with strategy, with determination. As she drifted off to sleep, Victoria smiled. Linda and Derek had thought they were teaching her a lesson. Instead, they'd taught themselves one. Never underestimate a woman who's built an empire from nothing. She knows how to fight, and more importantly, she knows how to win. Victoria woke to her phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. She grabbed it, squinting at the screen. 7:30 in the morning. She'd managed about 4 hours of sleep. It would have to be enough. The screen showed 12 missed calls and 23 emails. All in the past hour. Something was happening. She sat up and started scrolling through the emails. The first few were from James Morrison, each one time-stamped in the middle of his night. The investigation was moving faster than she'd expected. The first email, sent at 2 in the morning New York time, confirmed that Derek Patterson had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. James had personally reviewed the access logs, and what he'd found was worse than Victoria had described. Much worse. Derek hadn't just flagged Victoria's profile. Over the past 2 years, he'd marked 47 passengers for special handling. Every single one of them had some connection to a personal grievance. A lawyer who'd opposed him in a lawsuit. A doctor who'd refused to write a prescription for his wife. A teacher who'd given his daughter a failing grade. Even a mechanic who'd charged him for car repairs Derek thought were unnecessary. 47 people, all targeted. All given deliberately poor service, delayed flights, lost luggage, uncomfortable seats. Some had been flagged multiple times, turning every flight into a nightmare. And all because one man had decided to use his access to airline systems as his personal revenge tool. Victoria felt sick reading through the list. These were real people whose lives had been made harder for no reason except Derek's petty vindictiveness. How many vacations had he ruined? How many business trips had he sabotaged? How many people had arrived at important events stressed, exhausted, and humiliated? The second email from James, sent at 3:15, detailed the crew investigation. Linda and Troy weren't the only flight attendants who'd participated. Derek had a network of 10 crew members who regularly worked flights he managed. He'd give them the passenger list before each flight, highlighting anyone who was flagged. In exchange, he'd arrange their schedules to give them the most desirable routes and layovers. It was a systematic abuse of power that had been going on for years, and no one had caught it because the complaints were scattered across different flights, different routes, different time periods. Individual passengers would complain about bad service, but airlines received thousands of complaints. These particular ones had been lost in the noise, until Victoria had connected the dots. James's third email, sent at 4:30, was more personal. He wrote that he'd spent the past hour reading through passenger complaints and he'd found patterns he'd missed before. Spikes in negative feedback whenever Derek managed operations, higher rates of compensation requests, unusual numbers of missed connections and baggage issues. The data had been there all along. They just hadn't been looking for it. Victoria replied to his emails as she drank her coffee. "James, I appreciate the thorough investigation. What happens next?" His response came within minutes. He must have been glued to his laptop. "Conference call with the executive team in 1 hour. We're discussing immediate terminations and system reforms. Would you be willing to join? Your insights would be valuable." Victoria considered it. She had meetings scheduled all day in Singapore. Important meetings, the kind that determined whether deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars went through. But this was important too. Maybe more important. "Send me the dial-in information," she typed. "I'll be there." An hour later, Victoria sat at the desk in her hotel room, her laptop open to a video conference screen. James Morrison appeared first, looking like he hadn't slept. Then the rest of the executive team joined one by one. The chief operating officer, the head of human resources, the general counsel, and the vice president of customer experience. James made the introductions, and Victoria could see the discomfort on their faces. They knew who she was. They knew she could destroy their company's reputation with a single press release. They were terrified. Good, they should be. "Thank you all for joining," James began. "As I outlined in my emails last night, we have a serious situation. Derek Patterson, one of our operations managers, has been systematically abusing our passenger database to target individuals for poor service. Ms. Chen was one of his victims, and she's brought us evidence of a pattern of behavior that's been ongoing for at least 2 years. The chief operating officer, a stern-looking man named Richard, spoke up. "With all due respect, we have procedures in place to prevent this kind of thing. Background checks, ethics training, system audits, and yet it happened anyway." Victoria's voice was calm but firm. "Which suggests your procedures aren't working," Richard bristled. "We can't monitor every single employee action. We have thousands of staff members. I'm not asking you to monitor everyone. I'm asking you to design your systems so they can't be abused in the first place. Why does a single operations manager have unfettered access to passenger profiles? Why aren't there automatic flags when someone accesses the same profile multiple times? Why isn't there oversight when someone adds negative notes to a passenger file?" The head of IT, a woman named Karen, who'd been quiet until now, nodded slowly. "She's right. Our current system was designed for efficiency, not security. Any manager can access any profile for operational reasons. We assumed people would act in good faith. Never assume good faith when you can build in safeguards instead." Victoria pulled up her laptop screen, sharing a document she'd prepared that morning. "I've outlined some recommendations. Automatic audits, 2-person verification for negative profile flags, regular reviews of employee access patterns. None of this is complicated technology. It's basic security protocol." James leaned forward, studying her recommendations. "This is excellent, Victoria. Karen, can we implement these changes?" "Absolutely. I'd say within a month we could have most of these in place. Make it 2 weeks. James's voice left no room for argument. "This is priority 1. The general counsel cleared his throat. "We also need to discuss liability. If Ms. Chen decides to pursue legal action, and if other affected passengers join her, we're looking at potential damage. In the millions, maybe tens of millions." Everyone turned to look at Victoria. She could see the fear in their eyes. One word from her and she could tie them up in lawsuits for years. She could generate headlines that would cost them customers and drive down their stock price. She had all the power in this moment. "I'm not interested in a lawsuit," Victoria said quietly. "I'm interested in change." The relief in the room was palpable, but Victoria wasn't finished. "However, I want you to contact every single passenger Derek targeted. Personal apologies from the CEO, compensation for the flights they suffered through, and a detailed explanation of what happened and what you're doing to prevent it from happening again. These people deserve to know they weren't crazy, that it wasn't their fault." The vice president of customer experience, a young man who looked fresh out of graduate school, started taking notes. "We can do that. We should do that. And I want transparency." Victoria looked directly at James. "Issue a public statement acknowledging that there was a problem and explaining how you're fixing it. Don't name Derek or the crew members. That's not necessary. But be honest about the fact that your systems failed and you're taking responsibility." Richard looked like he might argue, but James cut him off. "Agreed. We'll draft the statement today." "What about the employees involved?" The HR director, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked genuinely troubled. "Derek and the flight attendants. I assume we're terminating them?" James nodded. "Derek is being terminated for gross misconduct and breach of company ethics. His access to all systems has already been revoked. The flight attendants who participated will also be terminated. This isn't a minor policy violation. This is deliberate, systematic abuse." Linda, the flight attendant from my flight, seemed to genuinely believe she was justified. Victoria remembered that conversation she'd overheard. "She thought I was discriminatory for not hiring Derek's nephew. That suggests Derek fed them a false narrative to get them on board with his scheme. That's not an excuse." James's voice was hard. "They're adults. They made choices. They treated passengers terribly because someone told them to, without verifying the story or questioning whether it was right. That's not the kind of judgment we want in our crew members." Victoria couldn't argue with that. Still, there was something sad about it. Linda and the others had probably thought they were fighting against injustice, standing up for someone who'd been wronged. They'd believed Derek's lies. That didn't excuse their actions, but it made them seem more human somehow, more like people who'd made terrible decisions than monsters who enjoyed cruelty. The meeting continued for another hour. They discussed timelines for implementation, communication strategies, additional audits to look for other potential abuses. Victoria contributed where she could, drawing on her own experience running a large company with thousands of employees. By the time they wrapped up, she felt cautiously optimistic. James seemed genuinely committed to making changes. The executive team, once they'd gotten past their initial defensiveness, had engaged constructively with her suggestions. This might actually lead to something positive. After the call ended, James stayed on the line. "Victoria, I can't thank you enough. You could have destroyed us. Instead, you're helping us become better. I'm not doing this for you, James. I'm doing it for the next passenger who might have been targeted. And the one after that. You were lucky it was me Derek chose to mess with. I had the resources and the connections to fight back. Most people don't, I know. And that makes what Derek did even worse." James rubbed his eyes. "I keep thinking about all those passengers. People who thought they were just having bad luck. People who maybe stopped flying with us because they thought we were a terrible airline. They had no idea someone was deliberately sabotaging their experience. That's why the personal apologies matter. Those people deserve closure. They deserve to know the truth. We'll make it happen. I promise." James paused. "Can I ask you something? What made you decide not to sue? It would have been the easier path. Hire lawyers, file papers, let the courts handle it." Victoria thought about that. "Because lawsuits are about punishment. I wanted prevention. If I sued you, you'd settle, pay some money, maybe fire a few people and then move on. But if I worked with you to actually fix the problem, we could create real change, not just for your airline, but maybe as a model for other companies facing similar issues. You're remarkable, you know that." Victoria laughed. "I'm pragmatic. There's a difference." They said their goodbyes, and Victoria finally closed her laptop. She glanced at the clock. She had 30 minutes before her first meeting of the day. Just enough time to grab a proper breakfast and review her presentation materials. As she stood to get ready, her phone buzzed again. A text from Roger, her lawyer. Saw the email from Morrison's team. "Impressive work. You got everything you wanted without firing a single legal shot. That's the Victoria Chen I know." She smiled and typed back. Sometimes the best victory is the one where everyone walks away better than they started. Talk later. Victoria looked at herself in the mirror. She looked tired but satisfied. Last night on that plane, she'd been humiliated and angry. Today, she'd helped fix a broken system that had been hurting people for years. Not bad for a day's work. Not bad at all. She grabbed her briefcase and headed out the door. She had a business empire to run after all. And now that this distraction was handled, she could get back to doing what she did best. Though she suspected this wouldn't be the last she heard about the airline situation. Change took time. There would be follow-up, verification, probably more problems discovered along the way, but she'd set things in motion. James and his team would take it from here, and if they didn't, well, Patricia, the journalist, was still waiting for her call. Sometimes you led with cooperation, but you always kept your leverage in reserve. That was just good business.